that, kind of includes your interest, sort of catches your interest, and then start there and, go on from there if you wish. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to look at 3 or 4, maybe 5 or 6 of these chapters, and not necessarily in order at all. All right, so as Martin showed, the book is very well illustrated, although if it were only to have one illustration, just one, it would be this one, right? The good and the bad, right there, right? So there's American Progress, pretty lily white, I would say, right? She seems to be carrying a laptop, although it's not yet wireless, clearly. She's actually laying telegraph, and the laptop is actually a book of knowledge. She's bringing with her a book of knowledge as she advances or enables the movement out to the west. That the indigenous people are not so happy about this and kind of cowering, trying to get out of her way, indeed, as was the case. So of course, at the time that it was painted, this was an optimistic view of the future, the great settlement of the West. We'll see a little bit more about that in a couple of minutes. But there's a double negative about this image about American culture, because what people don't say is that the other aspect of this painting is that to her right, you might recognize St. Louis, or at least the Mississippi River. What American Progress is doing is leaving St. Louis. She's not trying to make St. Louis a better place. She's intent, as was much of American culture, to make a better St. Louis somewhere else. And that burden has actually affected our urbanization substantially. The notion that we'll always improve by trying it again, as opposed to stay and make and improve what we've already established. All right. The book does begin with Sir Thomas Jefferson, another figure, of course, you might, you might sort of think differently about given sort of present conversations and actions in the street. But he had the clearest and most specific notion about what this sort of American egalitarian society ought to become, his agrarian republic. And that was that we would all, each of us, that is, as long as we were male and white, each of us would be able to acquire a quarter section of America. If you don't know what that term means, it's a quarter section of a mile square grid, 160 acres. And by each of us enabling to occupy that quarter section of land, we would maintain our freedom, we would maintain our social well-being, we would become independent of others, we would make our fortunes and that of our sort of subsequent generations as well. And so he sort of lays out, right after the revolution, a continental grid. And if you fly on a sunny day from Boston to San Francisco, you see many, many thousands of square miles laid out in this grid. And with this sort of Jeffersonian vision still very much in place. So the homestead, like Monticello, his own, was to be the building block of an American egalitarian, agrarian republic. Now, for those of you, of course, that have not visited Monticello recently with yourselves or your children, go back there, because finally, after nearly 2 centuries, there's a little exhibit there in honor of Sally Hemings, a slave owned by Jefferson among several hundred slaves that he owned. By the way, another sort of wonderful image of the kind of bountiful painting, bountiful American landscape, the plantation at the top of the hill, a city on the hill, but what's sort of sloping down the sides of the hill, of course, are the slave quarters, hardly identified by the painting itself. Sally Hemings took care of his children once his wife passed away. He fathered 6 children with her. 4 of them lived to adulthood. This was denied for, of course, until DNA evidence, as this image on the right shows, proved that Jefferson had another family. There's another family that Jefferson spawned, and its colors quite black, right? So do go back and visit finally the revelation of this aspect of Jefferson's sort of utopian and troubled heritage. Anyway, so in Jefferson's mind, that's what America would become. And thanks to American Progress, making land available so that each of us could acquire a Monticello. That wouldn't be so bad, actually. I wouldn't mind, owning a Monticello. sans slaves, of course, preferably. Now, in truth, we had to settle for something less than 160 acres, about an eighth of an acre, as you can see. So not exactly the homestead, not exactly Monticello, but not so bad for many Americans, actually. If you want to think of it that way, this is actually, when we talk about affordable housing, the suburb, you know, we hate to admit it right now, especially all of us urbanists, the suburb was, especially from the World War II onward, the suburb was the closest we've come to create affordable housing for virtually anyone. Again, short of course, the kind of racist mortgage lending and so forth. All right, so actually I think that Thomas Jefferson would be reasonably happy with this view. Not exactly 160 acres, but still almost 70% of Americans prior to the Great Recession owned their own home, owned their own property, and a little mini version of Monticello, you might say. What he would not be very happy with is actually this diagram. And so he's crying here in this image right there, right? So if we were today, as opposed to this notion of an egalitarian society, each of us equally owning a piece of America for our well-being, if we can convert that to, of course, our income levels, well, the 1% that we sometimes decry would own most of where American progress was headed, Lady Progress, and 40% of us, which I assume would be most of us on this program, would own that little red dot in the lower part of Texas. So that's where the kind of the utopian vision of Jefferson and many of the founders who believed that an equal access to land would prevent some of the kind of troubles associated with authoritarian governments and so forth, and inequalities, actually produced one of the most sort of speculative propositions dealing with land. And at the moment, this image is getting less true as opposed to much less this image. And indeed, most of us own a very, very tiny bit of America relative to not just geography, but also our level of income. And that's also not unrelated to the three crises we face today. All right. Nonetheless, chapter 6, if we were to bounce to chapter 6, is an account of the suburb as a form of utopian reaction to, of course, the onslaught of industrialized urbanism during the Industrial Revolution. And don't kid yourself, for many Americans, this still is, and I'll get to this later on if you ask the right question, this still is a very appealing image of a good life. And by the way, one of the most famous photographs of the 20th century, the second of the 20th century, is the one in the lower left, a young family, two little kids, very proudly standing in front of their first home, thanks to Mr. Levitt. And of course, you do not see headlines anywhere in America like the one that you see there, right? Low-priced homes suitable for any wage earner. Can you imagine the Globe with such a headline about properties, not just in Boston, but anywhere in the greater metropolitan area? So we cannot forget, actually, that this was a form of affordability, of course, because it actually was the product of a substantial amounts of public subsidies, which were not thought about as such at the time, obviously. But the equivalent of those subsidies are not sort of there in order to ease the unaffordability of all of a sudden of housing where we all want to get together, as opposed to settle another couple hundred acres out further away. So this chapter, in a way, is sort of out of fashion because it talks about the romance of the suburb, not, of course, the unsustainability of it and all the rest of the critique that, of course, we like to sort of address. But for much of the 19th century and much of the 20th century, indeed, grace dwelled in it. This is a quotation from a number of preachers who also sought the kind of the family building aspects of the American suburb. All right. Now, the suburb itself sort of harks back to another mythology, which is of the small town, and that's what chapter 4 is about. And indeed, the new urbanists, some of you are, I'm sure, are fans or or advocates or participants, the new urbanists sort of have rekindled that mythology about the proper place is not necessarily downtown Boston. That's full of all kinds of rasping frictions and so forth, even before the pandemic. The proper sort of American environment is a town, a small town, a wholesome town set in nature. The way to kind of solve the problem of the suburbs to create such towns as opposed to the sprawl that we have produced. And of course, it required, in order to achieve this, of course, at the scale of this, it required a particular instrument. And so chapter 12 is entitled Autopia. Indeed, the 20th century was an utopia for many. And by the way, the pandemic may make us love our cars more, at least hopefully just temporarily. If I do write another book, which is doubtful, it will only use illustrations of car advertisements because you can write a fabulous history of American urbanization in the 20th century just by car advertisements. This is one of the best, right? There's no place like Buick, right? So the car itself has sort of risen to the status of being a place itself as it got you to your preferred place somewhere, not in St. Louis, but outside of St. Louis, right? And then we have to remember, of course, Henry Ford's sort of memorable quote, "We shall solve the problem of the city by leaving the city." And he was hardly the only person who thought that way, although in his case, with his sort of particular instrument in mind. By the way, the term itself was created by Disney. In Disneyland, the original one, and we'll get to Walt in a second, Autopia, and it remains a ride, a very popular ride for little kids to kind of ride their little cars. By the way, look at the family. In this view, look, the dad seems slightly distracted. He's over there in the background. Here he's very happy, but the wife seems not so convinced about the no place, Buicks being places as well. All right, now guess what? Although inventing the term Autopia for a ride, children's ride, Walt Disney was a great hater of cars. By the way, he set out to invent a city as utopian as any actually in American history that would eliminate the need for cars, at least on the surface of the city. Epcot, not what you see now when you visit it, which is just to have a fancy amusement park, but Epcot, as Walt imagined it, was going to be a perfect town where indeed you would live and work. The work would be experimental. And indeed, the benefit of that work would be at first enjoyed by the workers themselves who would live in this kind of suburban-like environment and test out the products of their labors, like a better refrigerator before it would become to be marketed to, of course, the broader society. And his Imagineers produced some incredible images of what was to be Epcot, including, of course, monorails. You can see no visible cars. Another image, which I didn't include here, shows this incredible below-grade multi-level environment for trucks and cars, but they have no place on the surface because, indeed, Walt thought that cars were not the proper place in cities or in this kind of middle landscape kind of environment that he imagined. By the way, you can go onto YouTube and say Walt 1966, Epcot Center, and Uncle Walt will tell you still today, will tell you his version of what was to be an ideal city. In other words, and especially in the 60s, if those of you are old enough to remember, not kind of destroyed by urban renewal and full of all kinds of other strife and density and social ills, not the suburb itself already being thought about as sprawl, but the sort of best in between. And of course, Walt's idea of Epcot also kind of set in motion the kind of New Towns program that, again, some of you might remember, like Epcot, not Epcot, like Reston, Virginia, and Columbia, Maryland, and several others that were kind of realized on the vision, not of Epcot as was realized. Walt died a year later, and his sort of successors were less interested in that idea. All right, but that idea harkens back to another 19th century preoccupation with Americans, still very much part of American society, which is the kind of the veneration of nature and the notion of building a nature's nation. It's hard for us to say that as we destroy nature and we face its destruction through climate change, but the notion of creating a garden of the world and enjoying nature, not just in terms of consuming its resources, but benefiting socially, romantically, emotionally, intellectually, philosophically from the presence of nature was certainly something that the Transcendentalists spoke of and indeed inculcated in American culture through their literature. There's a painting and a photograph. The painting is of two important Americans, Thomas Cole, the painter of the American landscape, and Cullen Bryant, Go West Young Men fame. There they are, sort of enjoying the aura of nature. And then, of course, there still are places in America as this young family is enjoying the aura of the Grand Canyon as they come to see the majesty of the American environment, still in the hopes in the 19th century of creating this sort of nature's nation, which in the middle of at the end of the 19th century was sort of transformed into the notion of bringing nature back into the city through the work of Olmsted's and others, and the creation of some of the most incredible inventions to the kind of history of urbanization, which is the notion of a large-scale park for public purposes, not just Central Park, but indeed we've benefited even more from a full Olmstedian notion of a park system, a park and parkway system, the kind of lungs and arteries of the city in their mind, and the way in which to make the city more habitable, more humane for those least empowered to have their country estates as the 19th century industrial city kind of reached an almost inhabitable quality of life for many Americans, right? And indeed, some of you, I hope, in the audience are involved with the Emerald Network process, which is to try to extend the kind of tentacles of our own emerald necklace to reach the neighborhoods that the necklace hasn't actually done as much good for when it was designed. All right, so just a couple more, if I have time, although you can stop me, I guess, if you'd like. Chapter 7 is entitled Seeding Settlement. And this chapter deals with actually 4 policies enacted by Congress within just a couple of months. And this is actually to shame our Congress, which has done nothing in its 3.5 years and possibly longer, right? So within about 3 months, 4 incredible policies, acts of Congress were passed that still, of course, influence American culture today. And the first of which, of course, is very timely, obviously, which was the proclamation, the Emancipation Proclamation. But 3 others are less well known, but almost as significant, not in terms of kind of overcoming racism, but in terms of settling America. And so one of them was, of course, you could talk about in a negative sense. That is the kind of availability, finally, of the Jeffersonian idea, enacted only in 1862, of the idea of the homestead being available to you and me, now to women as well, although, and indeed to freed slaves, although not in the slave-owning southern states. Now, unfortunately, the opening up of such territories was again at the expense of the Indians, who were first herded into these areas, but then as pressure built to acquire your own homestead, the federal government would release a couple of more million acres for, in a sense, white settlement. So what you see so this is the Panhandle, a portion of Oklahoma Panhandle, the first of these 7 land rushes. Now, the photograph, the painting below says, okay, that's like Hollywood. That's a Hollywood image or a kind of a painting. That's not what happened. That is exactly what happened. That's what was called a rush. This is an actual photograph, right, of the rush as it begins on a fateful day when the army sort of steps away from the boundary, which it controlled for several months, and allows, of course, what in this case, so upwards of 60,000 settlers ready to race into the territory to acquire their piece of America, but not necessarily their homestead, their quarter section. You can see below on the right, Guthrie, Oklahoma, the first capital of Oklahoma, 4 days after the rush. All you have to do is sort of land somewhere. The smart people didn't head for the farm. Who wants to be a subsistence farmer in Oklahoma? They went into kind of where they thought the towns would be, because they were marked, and signs that said the post office would be here and the courthouse would be here and the train station would be here. And they would try to get one of those lots and set up a tent with whatever they had and therefore claim an unjumpable claim because of improvements. And imagine how much of America, the western parts of it, was settled through those kinds of rushes for land. But indeed, upwards of 4 million homesteads were established. And of course, some, not many, some still, of course, enjoy, and their descendants, I guess, enjoyed the benefit of that acquisition at virtually no cost of their piece of America. So this was the kind of the second act to establish the Homestead Act. And the third act at the time was, of course, the Morrill Act, not dealing with morals necessarily, dealing with education. This was Mr. Morrill, who said, you know what, Harvard and Princeton and Yale, forget about it. They're teaching classics and you know, Latin, and who needs that? We need to kind of create the equivalent of what we now call, you know, STEM, right? A STEM education, practical education. So a policy was passed to which the federal government would give upwards of 30,000 acres of land free to a state, times the number of actually members of the House of Representatives, so kind of favored the larger states. And the states could do whatever they wished with that land, but any proceeds of that land was to use to create a public university. So in a sense, the Morrill Act created the system of state universities across America, not just, you know, Texas A&M, as you can see down in the large photograph, but upwards of 69, 70 such institutions. By the way, including Cornell University, which has a kind of state aspect to it. And even MIT was originally a land grant institution. They were called land. Imagine that. Imagine, you know, Bernie Sanders, forget about it. Mr. Morrill actually created virtually free and public and useful, quote, education for many Americans. Now, of course, the southern states were not, the reason this passed was because the southern states were not voting in 1862, obviously, right? They were they were not voting in Congress. They actually opposed that well into the 1890s. Although Morrill thought that freed African Americans could also have entry to these institutions. That was not the case in the southern states even after the Civil War. Not until the second phase, the second Morrill Act passed in the 1890s, where the southern states agreed that they would allow access, but only if they were primarily a university for African Americans, which created some of kind of still the best known African American universities, again, largely in the South. So this was the kind of the third act passed by Congress in 1862. And the fourth was the funding of the Transcontinental Railroad. As, you know, so no longer did, you know, American progress have to kind of go afoot. One, in fact, could use the most important sort of mid-19th century infrastructure system to connect across the great continent of North America. And so, now of course, and again, you can see in one of the great photographs, the train heading to a new town. Notice who was in the smoke at the back of the train. Again, our indigenous populations. And the government, if the federal government did not only need, you know, the kind of 5 feet to either side of a track necessary to build a track, they needed upwards of 10 miles to other side of the projected right-of-way for the train. You can see in this map of Nebraska, look at that, about a quarter of Nebraska was given over to train companies. Most of that land, of course, was used by the train companies to sell to different kinds of homesteaders as well. And the companies were put together these fabulous posters. Look at that, California, Company of the World, offer $1 one-way tickets to Americans in St. Louis and Cleveland and so forth to head out to find their kind of a utopia out west. 43 million acres yet untaken, free of cyclones or blizzards, as the poster said. So imagine then Congress acting we talk about infrastructure, an infrastructure bill that's been kind of a whatever promise for 4 years. Imagine those 4 acts by one Congress within a matter of months. Shame on our Congress today. All right. I grew up in Chicago, so that tells you why there's a chapter on Chicago in this book. But indeed, Chicago was the first capital of capitalism before the moniker seemed to ascribe more directly to, of course, New York. This is chapter 11, and I call Chicago the original Amazon, and it is not an exaggeration. Actually, Amazon today is what Chicago was in the 1890s, right? If you remember Sears, even though it's going out of business, and Montgomery Ward and some of the other kind of late 19th century great department stores, those were the fulfillment centers of 100 years ago. By the way, don't ever complain about traffic, by the way, in urban America after you've seen this image of Chicago in 1890, right? Shame on you guys for worrying about traffic. So there it is, right? There's the Sears Roebuck, not the department store, but indeed the fulfillment center, although that's not what it was called. And as today, through a fulfillment center, you can get anything, anywhere you were, of course, a little bit slower by train as opposed to by drones or by trucks, anything, clothing, entire houses. The balloon frame construction process was perfected by these places. Armaments, of course, anything you needed to kind of farm equipment and so forth. And don't pay attention to that kind of electric belt up there. God knows what that is, but avert your eyes. I'm not sure what that is. But essentially, of course, Chicago was the kind of great center of the spider's web, connected by the Great Lakes to, of course, the oceans of the world, and from which, of course, the transcontinental railroad system extended. So stuff would come to Chicago, it would be transformed into products, and then sent out across America. So Mr. Bezos, you have invented nothing that was not the case in Chicago. And by the way, although Mr. Ford is sort of known to be the inventor of the assembly line, baloney. 20 years before he even imagined his Model T, the most amazing assembly line was in place in Chicago, but it was not to construct machines, it was to deconstruct animals. Upwards of 40,000 steer, 40,000 animals were, of course, slaughtered daily and, of course, sent off to feed America. One of the reasons actually for why some historians think that the North succeeded in the war is that it was fed by this assembly line from Chicago. And the place extended across 500 acres, which is practically the size of Cambridge, Massachusetts, not quite, I'm exaggerating. It was called Porktown, and it was also a gateway for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of immigrants who imagined a better life as a consequence of, at least momentarily, slaughtering animals in order to feed the rest of the country. Now, Chicago is also well known at the time for kind of bragging. The Windy City refers to the fact that Chicagoans like to brag about the place, as I'm doing right now. And so it produced this kind of amazing utopian confection, the Chicago World's Fair, in order to, of course, sort of suggest that it arrived amongst the kind of principal cities of the world. It was going to be just as good as Paris or Berlin or London. Chicago was. It was growing more rapidly than any country on the planet, any city on the planet, for several years on either side of the 19th to 20th century. But the significance of this was, in the end, actually less associated with Chicago, or less relevant to Chicago, not in the minds of Chicagoans, but it actually was the imagined future that was translated into the second design for our nation's capital. You know, L'Enfant, as some of you know, laid out this amazing plan that you can see it in the upper right back in the 1790s. Guess what? No one needed a city like that. Who the hell went to DC? The government was sort of weak. There was no industry there. There was no culture there. You can see the photographs at the end of the 19th century of a place that, you know, showed the kind of the axes of L'Enfant, but nothing else. It was the Chicago World's Fair that provided the impetus for saying, hey, this amazing scene cannot just be an apparition in honor of a celebration. Let's put it somewhere. Where should it be put but other than to actually create our imperial capital? So it was kind of the first moment, in fact, when the federal government grew substantially, needed more space, but also wanted to flex its muscles against the kind of the other great cultures and empires of the world. All right. And by the way, Chicago, a little bit less well known. We think about, of course, you know, the Emerald Necklace and Central Park and so forth. Chicago continued to produce one of the most sort of amazing collections of open space and public space anywhere in America, not just across a sort of 30-mile public edge along its lake, but also even adding to that with things like, of course, Millennium Place as well. But of course, Chicago, as other American cities, are very troubled and were troubled before the pandemic and the protests today. I took this photograph from a sort of friend's apartment, right? And that weekend, 11 people were murdered in Chicago and 70 more were shot, probably some more expired later on. So that's the kind of the dream of American cities, and how could you not like this image, but also the kind of the struggle always about the absence of social justice and equity. All right, so with that, let's skip to Las Vegas. I'm almost done. There's one more after this. My wife, Anne, has never forgiven me. She wrote a similar book, by the way, which I plagiarized. It's called Americans in Their Land. Here's a pitch for her book. She has not forgiven me for including a chapter on Las Vegas in this book about kind of idealizations and sort of utopian images, visions of a future urbanization. But it absolutely belongs because it actually is the home of two utopian conceptions of settlement. The first, of course, has to do, well, you could say with pleasure or vice if you're inclined that way, right? The first is of course, the casinos and the strip and all that kind of stuff. And by the way, the slogan is not, you know, what happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas, right? That's the kind of the PR slogan. In one's own mind, the slogan is, what happens at home stays at home for my weekend away or my cheap world-class, my middle-class cost world-class vacation or my week away. So there's the kind of utopia again of departure, of removing yourself from your kind of plight and experiencing, at least momentarily, something else. So that's the kind of one utopian conception of Las Vegas, which attracts upwards of 40 million people a year. To that, what's at home stays at home for the duration here while I'm here. But the other one actually has to do with the image on the right. Some of you might be surprised to know that more than 2 million people live in Las Vegas. It was during the 80s and 90s, the 70s, 80s, and 90s, up until the recession, the fastest growing American city in the United States. And why? Well, cheap land to acquire, in fact, your bit of the American dream, your own house and yard, although in a desert environment, a good steady job, well-paying, even if you did not have any education at all, right? And so it is actually the last bastion of what we thought about as the American dream. That is, that anyone, right? And of course, that tens of thousands of immigrants have gone to Las Vegas. So anyone could get a job. The union system in Las Vegas is sometimes called, Las Vegas sometimes referred to as the last Detroit. Not because of the demise of Detroit about white flight, but because the union system is still very much in place. So anyone could come to Las Vegas, get a job at a casino, a reasonable job, not maybe all that creative, but well paid reasonably, and to afford your own piece of the so-called American dream. And that's the kind of second utopia that you cannot find in much of America, because in fact, most Americans now cannot afford the scene that you see in the lower right. So that's why Las Vegas has a kind of role in this book. All right, I'm going to stop with chapter 9. And it has to do with trying to make a comparison about what happened at the end of the 19th century, the kind of first sort of great urban age. And of course, we've sort of, until of course the last couple of months, experienced the second great American urban age. Right, the last couple of decades is all about how great Boston is, and not so much, you know, Billerica. In the end of the 19th century, during the first great urban age, we had many of the same in fact, even kind of worsened social conditions on the right, as you can see. And on the left, we had the Bezos of their time, right? At that time called the robber barons. So on the one hand, there was incredible inequalities that were growing. There was incredible commitment to kind of, museums and cultural activities, because these robber barons were also kind of using their wealth to kind of create a sort of a more sort of beautiful or sort of a sort of physical world in which they could see themselves enjoying. At the same time, immigration, because of the process of urbanization, immigration was drawing millions of people, both from across the oceans and from many of those subsistence homestead farms, to the city. So the 1% and the 99% was very much in place at that time. But the difference was, these people, right? And of course, others as well. These 4 books I would read before you would read mine, although I'd appreciate if you'd buy a copy of my book. They're still in print 100 years later. And so while the robber barons were doing what our robber barons are doing, what our great kind of industrialists and IT people and Googles and so forth of the world are doing to improve the world, they were dealing with the 99%. And both through kind of very specific policies, such as, of course, clean water and the extension of services like electricity and sewer systems, and of course, campaigns against municipal corruption, and on and on. Zoning, for example, right? The emergence actually of the planning profession that is trying to kind of deal with improving the quality of space and life in our urban centers. These folks were involved with that at the same time as the kind of Bezos of the time were creating their fulfillment centers and so forth. And the question that I have for all of you is, who are these people now? Where is William Dean Howells, and where is my particular hero, Jane Addams? Not Jane Jacobs, Jane Addams, right? And where is Edward Bellamy? Where is Jacob Riis, who sort of photographed the other half, although they were much more than the other half. And that's the part of our second urban age that doesn't seem to have a comparison right now to the first urban age, which in addition to the guys below here had these people who were trying to improve substantially the lives of the 99% versus the 1%. And we need people like that today. So I will end actually with 2 quotations. The first is, again, my particular heroine, Jane Addams, who created the settlement houses to try to kind of find ways to kind of help adapt immigrants, largely, children especially, women especially, because the men were at the slaughterhouses, to kind of accept, become acclimated to kind of an urban culture, an American culture. And she said the following, amongst many amazing things, although Martin, your image hides some of the quotations. So the good can only be extended to society before it can be held secure by any one person or any one class. But we have not yet learned to add that statement that unless all in all classes are able to contribute to a good, we cannot even be sure that it is worth having. An amazing idea about actually equality expressed beautifully. And of course, she eventually was one of the first women to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. And here's the second one, which tries to suggest that we should think about what good has come out of the pandemic, right? Clean air. So why not, of course, work very hard while we're all together, as we say, to make sure that the Himalayas stay visible to most of India, right? So here's a quote that deals with Boston, actually. It was made by an immigrant from Germany who became a senator, Karl Schurz, and he said, and this is why I still think ideals are important, ideals are like stars. You will not succeed in touching them with your hands, but like the seafaring man, you choose them as guides, and following them will reach your destiny. And this is why I think that despite the lack of optimism, despite all of our troubles, a certain amount of idealism perhaps should reemerge somehow if indeed we want to overcome many of the limitations, social, racial, and economic, that confront us today. So thank you. I'll stop there. And maybe stop sharing so I can see some of your
those faces. Thanks so much, Alex. That was really, really wonderful and great to sort of have this overview through so many of the distinct chapters of American history and sort of an understanding of settlement, all really encapsulated quite beautifully by that last quote. I was really, struck by that, sort of the not necessarily the ability to attain the stars, but to use them as a guiding light. So quite beautiful in terms of that metaphor.
I wish I would have said it, but I attribute it to a German immigrant who, of course, loved arriving at the new world for him, right? So a couple of comments or questions or rebuttals to this idealistic view of American history.
Sure, if anyone has questions, please do. Put those into the chat room. I think we topped out at about 75 people today, which is remarkable. We're still up at about 70 people, which is really wonderful. And so I guess while we're waiting for a few questions, I alluded to this one before when I was chatting with Alex. Knowing, how much of a scholar you are of Boston's history, and certainly as a collector of maps for the Great Leventhal collection, if you would reflect, because certainly it was a theme coming through so much of the book, and it's really, attributed to the current moment as well, but reflect a little bit on observations you might have with sort of the role of race in Boston's physical evolution, and sort of some of the remnants of that today, and certainly, some of the, potentially positive movements or not positive movements that we might think about in our own city, because certainly it plays out spatially in Boston, in particular. So if you could, love to hear any comments on that.
Sure.
It's tough.
I'm sure, one of the easiest questions to answer, right?
Exactly.
But look, you know what you got to do? You got to find yourself an MBTA map and stare at it for a while, and especially stare at the orange line, kind of heading sort of that way, right? From the downtown slightly westward, south and westward, and the red line, sort of not exactly hugging the coast, but kind of heading kind of southward and closer to the coast. And guess what? Focus on the triangle between. Guess what? There's no major parks there. There's no major transit lines there. There's no major industries there, other than actually at the very tip when it gets closer, of course, to the downtown. And that's where most of our African-American populations live today and have lived forever. So indeed, you can look at a map of Boston and understand how geography has sort of instilled a certain amount of kind of injustice, not just through policies, but actually through geography as well. Now, by the way, what caused this triangle in a way, right? Because at the tip of the triangle was one of the former wetlands, right? It was the South Bay, right? So of course, to create Dorchester Avenue, you have to go this way, and to create whatever Washington Street, you have to go that way. So the triangle sort of created not to kind of create a place for African Americans. The triangle was trying to avoid South Bay before it was filled and get to the rest of the city in the South, right? But indeed, if you want to help Boston right now, if you want to be an advocate, think about that triangle. Think about all the things that actually are absent there, as opposed to say at JP, where I live, much less the Back Bay, and figure out how you might try to undo. So, it's not. I'm not sure it was the best answer to your question, but it's not. I think it's a partial answer to the question. Obviously, Boston has had much more sort of overt racist actions as well. It has not been a very happy place across its history with regards to others, including even the kind of the poor virtually indentured Irishmen who replaced the ladies of the loom to work all the mills in the middle of the 19th century. Right? So yes, indeed, racism is very much embedded in urban geography across America. And so if there's a kind of another book to be written, it might deal with that. Although there's a book that just came out, and I won't be able to remember its title exactly, The Something of Law. Oh gosh, some of you might know it. And it's an amazing book, The Something of Law. I'm sorry, my mind is another senior moment here. And it's an amazing description about how geography enabled discrimination, actually. Yeah. Somebody's speaking, but very softly. Hello?
I think, I'm not sure if that's intentional or.
The color of law.
The Color of Law, thank you.
There you go.
Yes, buy my book, but along with The Color of Law. That's the kind of the other side of many of the same issues, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask Rami if I know one of the questions that Rami had was about the, subsequent chapters that you might identify, but, given that I'm not seeing any questions yet in the chat, I'll ask Rami if he's got a question for us.
Well, you're free to answer that one or ignore it, and I can ask you another.
Well, again, I don't know what the next chapter would be in such a book. I think it would be a different book. It might be The Color of Law, actually, or sort of my, it's not written by a designer, so my version of The Color of Law would deal with things more expressly, would deal with the way in which actually our interest in land being a principal source of well-being, dating back to Jefferson, has also created one of the most sort of speculative economies in the world, and has actually kind of sort of accelerated through speculation on land some of our other kind of less just social phenomena. Mm-hmm. I was hoping for a question about, well, gee, is it true that the pandemic will create the suburb again? Or will make us go to the suburbs. And I don't know how many of you think that. I bet most of you are urbanists who don't believe that. There's some truth to that, but there's actually a reason for why the suburbs will not continue to grow exponentially, and it has nothing to do with the fact that we're all now love cities. But if you're interested in my take on that, I actually can tell you why the suburb will not ever again reach the kind of the favors that it has in American culture. But again, it's not because urbanists have won the day. That's not true at all, right? So actually, can I show you a couple more slides? Just a couple more?
Yeah, please do.
So how do I do,
you just share your
screen
screen.
Again, okay, oh yeah, so there, whoops, oh yeah, okay. There, okay, so, whoops, okay, whoops. I need to go back to the overall, I don't know if I could,
yeah.
It seems to be stuck. Can somebody unstuck me? Actually, stop share again. And what I need to do is, whoops, sorry, end. Okay, yes, all right, so here, look, guess what? Those of you who think that millennials are going to save us and they will always want to live in a micro unit on top of a Starbucks, well, guess what? In any poll taken by millennials, we tend to think of millennials as sort of young white people who work at Google. 60% of millennials actually would prefer to live in the suburb. Now, that's kind of shocking. And by the way, 50% already do live in the suburb, right? And actually, most of them own cars. The drop in car ownerships among millennials is about 1%, not the kind of, oh no, we will always be on our bicycles forever after, even having to commute 30, 40, 50 miles. All right, so I'm joking right now. So there it is, right? 66 million in most polls say, I'd want to live in the suburbs. So much for this book, which don't bother getting, because I don't think it's actually particularly good. All right, but here's the answer, right? So the answer starts with a question, and that is, so how many households in America right now constitute the archetypal family? That is, two adults, they could be gay, right? It could be two men or two women, who have one or two or three kids of school age, and then possibly a dog, right? So what percentage of households in America constitute that middle? And now, because I've asked the question that way, you're going to say, oh yeah, very little. And that's true, right? But if I were to ask that question of an audience away from whatever the BSA, they would say, "Oh, it's got to be 50% of families, American families. That's the households are made by families." If I was to ask that question back in 1930, the answer would be more than 50%. Now, the answer today is, depending upon which demographer you believe, is somewhere between 18 and 23%. Well, guess what? That 23%, for those 23% of households, the suburb is still a pretty darn good idea, a pretty attractive idea, not just in terms of affordability these days, because no one can buy in the Back Bay these days, right? But also because of yard for the kids and a larger house, because you need a larger house if you're going to have a family, not to mention a pet or two, and so forth. So for those 23%, of which actually the millenniums now are in that category, the suburb is still a pretty good deal. Not for 100% of those 23%, but for a lot of them. Now, but for the 80% that are not households, right? The young that are staying young much longer, don't have a need for, a lawnmower quite yet. They're very much interested in kind of the buzz of urbanism and where the jobs are and where they can meet one another and the best coffee shop and all that kind of stuff, right? On the one hand, as the young stay young longer before so all the talk about the millennials loving cities was before their family building era. And then of course, people like me, a empty nester right now, well, I don't need a lawnmower either. Actually, I've never had one, but that's a different matter, because we now have 20, 30, 40 years of active life ahead of us. Once our kids leave, we want to be next to kind of cool coffee shops too, or cultural facilities, or a good health care, and so on. And so a percentage of that portion of the 80%, of course, are not immediately attracted to the suburban environment. So what's changed, actually, if I can go back here, is actuarial science is what has changed our interest in cities, right?
Are you sharing slides, Alex?
What's that?
Are you sharing slides?
I am.
Oh, we're not seeing them.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
That's too bad. Right. That's really a shame.
I'm sorry to interrupt, yeah, but.
So how do we?
Try to share screen again.
Well, first I have to unshare, I guess, right? Or something. Okay, share screen. Okay. All right. There. Can you see anything? A big Zoom symbol.
Well, a big black screen.
Really? Well, that's where Zoom occasionally starts to fail us.
Yes.
Yes. Well, so look. It doesn't matter, right? Okay. I can imagine, right? Imagine a family, and imagine, of course, which is now constitutes about 20%, and imagine the young and the old, right? And so the family people, actually a certain percentage of them will still find the suburb attractive and advantageous, not just financially, right? And so that's why the suburb is not going to disappear. But given that we live longer than we did back in Olmsted days or Daniel Burnham days, right? The percentage of one's life dedicated to family building, for which the suburb is a very good place to build your family, which is why 66% of millennials are now heading that way, will still be the case. But for that 80%, and this is something that our sort of housing mandates and developers haven't yet figured out, there are 80% of households who are not as interested in suburbs. Some of them might be, but not a lot of them. So that's what's changed. It's not all of a sudden that Americans have decided to love cities as opposed to all else, right? Now, of course, our economies are also subject to that actuarial science as well, because indeed, since the young who are staying young longer and are the kind of entrepreneurs who's moving back into the city before the people move back into the city, some of the companies and so forth, right? And so do the kind of the empty nesters, not in as large numbers as the young, but a fair number of them. So it's actually the fact that my kid, and knock on wood, although I don't see any at the moment here, my kid is expected to live, he's 25 years old, possibly to be 100, right? but the amount of time in his life dedicated to the family, that percentage is much smaller. And for much of the next, for his first 25 years and probably another 10, he's not interested in the suburbs, nor he will be like me when he becomes an empty nester. And so our home building industries have not yet figured this out as fully as they should, because of course the idea of a home, the idea of a family, the idea of a kind of piece of land for yourself, a yard, still tends to kind of consume much of Americans' kind of both sensibility and mythology. So that's my answer, and that's why so the pandemic will of course move some people back to the suburb. The unaffordability of urban America will do more of that. But long term, there's not going to be no great swing back to, because for 80% of households, the suburb is not a good idea, not the best form of inhabitation or propinquity building.
Great. Yes. So I think we, ultimately,
But
yeah.
So the images just showed nice couples and families and all that stuff. So you can imagine, right?
That's great.
And dogs too, yeah.
So we did get a couple of questions that came through, and I'll read you the first, it's actually from a former student of yours, Karen.
Why didn't I give him an A or what? That better not be the
I hope
question.
so, yeah. Karen Mata Ortas, who you know.
Oh yes, I know very well.
Who I know well, fortunately, very well now as well. So Karen asks, you mentioned 4 policies written by Congress that have shaped the United States as we know it today. What do you think need to be the equivalent policies required today, maybe to address social inequities?
Yeah, these students are just too smart.
I know.
These smart questions. Well, first of all, I'm not saying there have only been 4 policies, right? That point was that all 4 were passed by Congress within a matter of months. That was the amazing thing, right? Yeah. Not in a matter of decades or centuries, a matter of months. So first let me say, okay, what were the 4 policies that built the suburb? And especially in the post-war period. It was our highway building program. That's a form of social subsidy, right? It's a form of subsidy, right? We don't think of it that way, but it is, right? The expansion of all of the other infrastructure systems, water, sewers earlier on and so forth, electricity and so forth, right? Too. The enabling of the kind of reduction of kind of restrictions against farmland and other uses that would enable zoning to use it for homes. The availability of land, also a form of subsidy actually, making land cheaply available. And the 4th, of course, being especially in the post-war period, but even earlier, the kind of low tenured mortgage, low cost, long-term mortgage. Talk about a subsidy, right? The fact that you can, borrow 80, sometimes 100%, which of course happened during the Great Recession, of not your own money, right? In order to kind of fund your castle in the suburbs. And it would take 20 years to kind of pay off, or 30 or 40. And by the way, you could deduct that on your taxes. Oh my goodness. I mean, that's the most amazing subsidy on behalf of home ownerships ever, right? And again, you could say it's a subsidy. They weren't called that way. So those 4 actually, even though the kind of cultural inclination was to centralize, even back to Jefferson, those 4 governmental subsidies actually enabled many of us to acquire a suburban ideal, right? So the question is, now when everyone wants to be, not everyone, but the 80% of households wants to be in kind of more dense environments, more urban environments, what should the equivalent of those 4 subsidies be today? Karen, that's the question you should have asked, right? What the equivalent of those 4, not the Homestead Act, right? What the equivalent of those 4 subsidies ought to be today. How do we create subsidies that would enable, in a denser situation, and of course density is a terrible word for many Americans, let's not forget that, to enable affordability in our cities, right? So is it zoning in support of density? Good luck, right? But necessary. Is it some other kinds of financial mechanism? Maybe you should be able to tax deduct your rent, not just your mortgage, right? What else? well, now the question is back to all of you here, right? Because that's what's missing right now. And it's completely overlooked that the suburb was created substantially, not through lack of interest in the suburb, that was there anyway, but enabled by public subsidies. And people say, well, gosh, you know, there are no public subsidies today for housing. Well, there should be, because there certainly was at the time when the suburb exploded. So we need kind of, I ask all of you that question. So maybe the two that I've mentioned, okay, right? The kind of the rent as a form of a tax deductible, right? That would help a lot, right? Maybe, you know, just bullying through more density in kind of urban America, although that's goes against sort of, you know, a lot of public opinion. But what else? Because those subsidies, the market itself will not produce affordability in urban America right now, as long as the pressure is on less space. When it was about more space, easy. There, you know, it was always easy to kind of get another 200 acres of useless former farmland to build your seaside on, right?
How about subsidies for transit rather than?
Well, that would be another one, of course. Although transit at the moment will have its own kind of moment of disrespect, right?
It'll come back. So that it sort of leads to another interesting question. I think you just barely touched on it, but for me, it's actually, you know, quite interesting in terms of the dynamic between you know, the public and private in a way. But that is to say, the allowing private development to shape the city for profit and start planning a city that works for everyone, regardless of race or income. So that's a question coming from Eric in the audience, but basically it sort of asks about you know, the acquiescence of public agencies to allow private development to really give form to our cities, as opposed to a more robust and stronger sort of planning efforts by organization.
Well, yeah, yes, that would be good. So just a couple of things, and not broadening the point a little bit. First of all, I think what we need more than that particular rebalance that is important is to find a way to move away from the home rule. And boy, that's a controversial statement, right? That is, you know what? Boston should not be able to plan by completely disregarding what Cambridge is doing and the opposite. Mm-hmm. This is where actually the Chinese are ahead of us. And don't get me wrong here. They're not producing utopias there, but the fact that they can plan, at least in terms of infrastructure and many other things at a regional scale, at a county scale, at virtually a state scale, actually virtually a national scale, is not so bad. And as long as we have no process for regional planning, we're stuck right now, because in fact, there's very few problems, whether it's housing or transit or anything else actually, or any kind of social equity that can be solved at the scale of a Boston or a Cambridge or a Somerville and so forth. So the fact that we have an almost total historic absence and disregard out of the idea about, okay, the myth of the town, that's where we belong. The town needs to plan for itself because the next town can plan for itself. It's a great idea for the 16th century. That's a great idea for the 21st century. So that's one thing that needs to change, is finding a way to overcome resistance to regional planning. In terms, more specifically, I think there has been a kind of a move away from sort of public responsibility for controlling development. And, you know, that requires, you know, another book and certainly more than another 2-minute answer. What caused that? Actually, the kind of the urban renewal oddly caused that, right? You think of urban renewal in its kind of worst sense, of course, as displacement and so building crappy public housing and gentrification and so forth, all true and not debatable actually, right? But in fact, that again, if you think about, this was a program by which a lot of federal dollars came into cities. And of course, the city managers and mayors decided to build, not public housing, but to build, other things that they don't, office parks and so forth, right? So the fact that this was a huge slug of public money sent to cities although it was one of the other sort of less well-known aspects of urban renewal. We don't have that right now, and that's another the dilemma. There's very little support, public support, right? Federal support for urban investment, but that slug of money enabled developers to kind of do their thing, to kind of rebuild the city. The American city at mid-century was not a great place, right? Think about this. Between the Depression, starting in the late 20s, and through World War II, that's 20 years, no one was investing in cities, right? We were first trying to overcome the Depression. Second, we were trying to, win the war against the bad guys across the ocean and so forth. So the cities decayed at the same time as immigration continued, and especially from the South. And at the same time as the suburb began to be more reachable, and so the white flight took place. So between the late 20s and the late 40s, and actually the 50s and 60s, the city was falling apart. And so radical actions had to kind of be invented. Urban renewal was one, and I'm not defending it by any means, but it seemed necessary because otherwise we would all have become Detroit. And by the way, Boston came close to becoming Detroit. It lost a quarter of its population in about a matter of 2 decades, about 30% of its taxable base, right? It was the Detroit of the 1950s, right? Before Detroit got there. But the funny thing was that all that money that came in somehow enabled the private sector to reemerge, which had been missing from the cities for those decades, and to take control, kind of. And the city, in a way, all the money that the cities were given by the federal government was not used to control developers. It was used to attract developers. And then they start to do what they're doing. And that's when the imbalance start to become a little bit more extreme. How to turn that around, I'm not sure I have a good answer for that. Perhaps some of you do.
I know, and I remember, from years ago, that sort of conversation about the sort of the pendulum swinging back and forth between the sort of the regional versus local in terms of what is in favor by planners, and the extent to which those conversations, go back and forth at the local versus the regional scale. And somehow it's always, oftentimes thought of, oh, regionalism is the way we need to think. And then the counterbalance to regionalism is that localism, and that the trends at least tend to shift back and forth, but nevertheless.
Well, not enough. They never shift actually towards the regional in terms of affecting, say, zoning or planning, right?
True.
They always come back to the local, right? Yeah.
So just to sort of to wrap up, and we'll try to, silver linings, as I like to try to call them, at least right now, for a very trying time that we're going through on a number of levels between the pandemic and the issues of social equity. If at all you see, positive developments in urban America, given that your book is concentrated on urban America, where might we begin to be hopeful about some of the recent trends, or hopeful future trends that we might begin either to advocate for or begin to gain some traction? So if we were trying to end on a positive note, or some notes, what might that be?
Well, there's sort of, in a way, kind of separate from whether the economy is going to come back or not. It will come back eventually, right? Separate the pandemic from the kind of the Black Lives Matter movement, right? The positive trend of the Black Lives Matter movement is actually, it seems that this is a kind of moment of actual change, right? By the way, I'm old enough to have participated in the 1968 demonstrations in Chicago at the Chicago Democratic Convention, which turned into real mayhem. I mean, people died and cars were burned by the dozens and so forth. I didn't burn any, but that's a separate matter, right? And by the way, so there you were in 1968, and against the war, civil rights, violent civil rights demonstrations for most of the 60s. Martin Luther King is shot. 3 months later, Robert Kennedy is shot. It was a horrible time in America, right? Could you ever have imagined that we would be in the same place 50 years later? I wouldn't have. I certainly wouldn't have, right? So actually, the most positive thing, I think, at the moment is actually the protests. And that the question is, they will eventually stop, we will eventually stop protesting in the streets. So what will happen after? How to maintain that into actual creation of policies, not just against, defunding the police, right? But broader social policies that would capture that new awareness of how unjust of a society we are and have been. So I would say that is, even though it was the result of horrible murders and so forth, I think that's the action in the streets is positive. Never mind what Trump thinks of it, right? But the positive in the pandemic is a little more subtle, and yet I think it's there too. See, earlier on, not so much today actually, because we're confused about whether we should wear masks or not, right? But earlier on, there were these amazing photographs of the Himalayas, right? There was this amazing photograph of how Los Angeles County had the cleanest air in decades, right? There's another diagram I'm sure some of you saw in the New York Times and other papers, which showed that in the kind of great megalopolis of which we're a part, right? Washington to Boston, right? The largest city on the planet in a way, right? Continuous urbanization corridor, how the quality of air was measurably cleaner. Wow. Those are positive things, right? Those are pretty positive things. Actually, the fact that we now realize that we can do more work at home than people thought we should be able to do, that's a positive too. The negative is we now realize that working always at home is no great shakes either, right? So the illusion about working at home is also exposed. But the positive thing is that there will, even after the pandemic, we will not go back all to work, next to each other, not because of the pandemic, but because, of course, the ability to kind of converse and work and so forth, interrelate, will be more flexible. I think that's a positive too. The fact that our streets were uncongested for a period of time is a positive. How do we maintain that, right? What do we do now, whether it's through sidewalk design or park building or, more restrictions against the car, which of course will be there more than ever for, the foreseeable future, but hopefully not forever. That's a positive, actually. The fact that I'm sorry, all of a sudden I'm become like a sort of childish romantic. The fact that you saw couples hand in hand taking daily walks, which you didn't see as much before, is a positive. Let's hope that that continues even when the restrictions on distance goes away. So if we could kind of if we can actually take those odd little kind of exposings of good things as a consequence of the pandemic, if we can all together, as we say, maintain those, work for those found a pandemic, that would be pretty darn good.
And on that note, I think that's just a great observation. I really, really appreciate you're spending the time with all of us in this new virtual community. I think on a very selfish note, the attendance at our new BSA urban design events. In the past, we would maybe get about 20 people downtown, and for each of these events, we've had well over 60 or 70 people. So we're able to share ideas a little bit more freely from our homes. And at some point in the future, we'll be together again, sharing ideas. But a big round of applause for Alex. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk about your book, to talk about your ideas for the American city. And we look for this moment and those very positive aspects that you just outlined. So thanks again.
Well, thank you. Thank you for participating. I see many familiar faces. So we'll see each other for real sometime soon. Another positive to come, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much, Alex. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.